initiative focuses. And what we think are those elements of that we need to invest in to ensure the students have the best chance of collegiate success. And that's why we're focusing on those elements we test for entering students, which is English language competency and quantitative reasoning and math.
Johan?
I'm glad I get the opportunity to ask my question, but I want to give a little bit of background to my question so it doesn't seem primitive. The Student Fee Policy Advisory Committee, which I sit on and Jeremy sat on and Hector Jacinto sat on, we voted on a Monday to suspend the vote on the student success fee until there was a discussion with faculty and administrators and students involved on alternative methods to increase graduation rates on this campus. That vote, and I'm still confused as to why, was ignored, and another meeting was called where the same item was put in the agenda, which was whether or not to recommend the fee, at which point we felt as we had no other option but to vote to recommend that the fee not be implemented. Not only did the Student Fee Policy Advisory Committee do that, ASI passed a resolution saying that on behalf of the students, and you said that you recognize ASI as the voice of the students, on behalf of the students, we do not support the student success fee. We think that there are other ways to achieve the same goal. We think that it's not the right time to implement that kind of a fee. And in the alternative consultation process, which I went to both meetings, although there weren't that many students, the ones that were there seemed to, with the exception of one, Louis, everyone that was there seemed to unanimously not want the fee. And the arguments weren't primitive. They weren't small-minded. They were eloquent. We had other ideas. We had plans. We wanted to take action in other ways that would actually get results. We weren't given the opportunity. You said in the beginning that we operate under a concept of shared governance. And shared governance, yeah. I go to CSSA every month with Jeremy. Now we're going to start going with Hector. And we talk to the trustee, the student trustee, and we have more shared governance in the board of directors than we do in our own campus right now. In regards to this, in regards to fees. Our student trustees get to vote. We get one vote on the fees, on the tuition. We don't get a vote that counts here. And the idea is that the shared governance will come through influence. But the student body unanimously tried to push its influence a lot, saying, we don't want this fee. This isn't the right fee. There are other ideas. And we weren't heard, and we didn't receive a response.
Well, Johan, I would not agree with you as relates to that, in terms of whether you were heard or not. The concept of shared governance doesn't mean shared decision-making. The academic senate doesn't make decisions on the campus. The president does on delegation of authority from the trustees through the chancellor to me. The academic senate's advisory to the president, just as the ASI is advisory, with regard to issues that are part of the shared governance arena. Within the context of the ASI as a board, I have no discretion as relates to decisions that you make, because you are, if you will, a separate corporation with your own bylaws. The only thing I can do relative to the ASI is to make a judgment about whether you should be considered on an ongoing basis an approved auxiliary on the campus of Cal State LA. You know, for example, in Jeremy's case, if you had decided that you wanted Jeremy to continue as the president of the ASI, the only thing I could try to do would be to ask the chancellor to declare you not a, if you will, an approved organization on the campus. I can't tell you what to do as relates to that. So within that context, even as you discuss notions about shared governance, shared decision-making, I can't tell the ASI what to do, because you are a separate enterprise with articles of incorporation and authority that's associated with that. The same obtains within the context of shared governance. Doesn't mean shared decision-making. At the end of the day, the Student Fee Advisory Committee agreed to the process that was laid out with regard to the student success fee. And that is what was followed by, if you will, the administration, leading up to a decision. The reason you were reconvened is because you have an obligation to make a recommendation consistent with what your earlier decision was to support that. Doesn't necessarily mean that I don't always agree with the Senate about a lot of things. I don't always agree with you guys. Sometimes when it comes to your budget, on occasions I will raise questions and ask you to reconsider, you know, for example, but I can't tell you how to allocate resources, you know, for example, and I can't force you to, if you will, enforce your own bylaws. And there was and I can speak to that from experience, going back about 20 years, because there was another example of a student who hadn't gone to classes for almost 2 quarters and clearly was not eligible. And we tried to, if you will, say that you couldn't function in that regard. And the Superior Court judge says that you can only take away the right for that organization to be an approved organization. You cannot dictate to that organization as to how it conducts its business, for example. The same obtains with respect to the university, for example. And notions about shared governance. If you go into Title V, if you go into the Board of Trustees organization rules or whatever, if a faculty member doesn't get promoted here, it's based on the decision that I make. The faculty member can grieve that decision. It doesn't go to the Board of Trustees because it's delegated authority for making the final decision with respect to that. On the student success fee, I don't have responsibility for making the final decision. I only make a recommendation to the chancellor. The chancellor makes the final decision as relates to that. And all of the information, inclusive of the vote of the Student Fee Advisory Committee, the resolution from the ASI, all of that was provided to the chancellor for his consideration as relates to the requests that essentially went to the chancellor.
And to you as well when you decided to make your recommendation.
I made the recommendation to the chancellor, and I made that recommendation based on what I felt and still feel is in the best interest of the students who attend this university.
Okay, well, I don't know, you still have enough time, to stay here for a couple more?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just do one more question from the board of directors, which I have Addison, I do apologize, Addison, and then hopefully we'll have time for the public to ask more questions, okay? Okay, Addison?
The question I wanted to ask is that, do you foresee any quality issues when we over-enroll? So you said that we over-enrolled 102%, 102%?
No. We didn't over-enroll. We were allowed to enroll up to 103% more than what our target was.
Right.
And we will come in under 103%.
Okay, so do you foresee, when enrollment is over 100%, any type of quality issues as far as having too many students in the classroom, or when we do over-enroll, we're not over-enroll, but when we have too many students in the classroom, do you foresee any quality issues with over-enrollment?
That's the reason why they set the limit where it's set for all of the campuses. Is that and historically in the state of California, we used to get funding from the legislature if we were over-enrolled. And they took money away from us if we were under-enrolled. And it was a plus or minus 2% sort of a situation where if you were more than 2% over-enrolled, the legislature gave you additional dollars support per FTE. If you were under, you had to pay money back if you were under 2%. And that rule still applies, except that they've now raised it to 3%. You can be 3% over-enrolled, but no more than that. And part of the motivation, Addison, for that is that if we continue to demonstrate to the legislature that we can over-enroll by the tune of 70,000 students with no more money than what they provided us, why would we expect that they would give us money to cover those, if you will, 70,000 students, FTEs? And those 70,000 FTEs are being supported on a marginal basis, not on a funded basis. What used to happen when the state still supported us appropriately was that our enrollment would get built for the next year, and we would get enrollment dollars for that over-enrollment, plus a slight enrollment increase. That's not the case anymore. This campus has historically, at least since I've been here, decided that there ought to be a certain dollar level of support behind every student. When we look like we're going to go beyond that, we say we don't want any more enrollment, for example. And your question with respect to quality, at the present time, we probably underutilize, if you will, instructional space at this campus versus other CSUs. We also have, on the average, the smallest class size of any of the CSUs. And in general, we also have the lowest student-faculty ratio. We don't even come close to what is even in our budget guidelines on an annual basis. And if you take into consideration that 16 units generally would be considered to be a full load, and we're only at 12, there's still some capacity. One of the things that worries people like me is one of these days, the ledge analyst is going to say, we fund you, CSU, with the assumption that a student that we give you money for is taking 16 units. But on the average within the CSU generally system-wide, students are only taking about 12. So we're overfunding you. It's sort of what they said 4 years ago when they said, we're no longer going to fund all enrollment out of the general fund. We'll only fund resident enrollment. Because it used to be that non-residents, we got money for non-residents out of the general fund when non-residents were supposedly paying full cost. Well, anymore now, we get 2 enrollment targets, one for resident and one for non-resident. Now the danger in that is that if I overestimate the number of non-residents we're going to enroll, for every 100 of those, that's over $1 million in revenue lost. So if I budgeted for the year for 1,000 non-residents, and somehow or the other we don't reserve or adjust the budget during the course of the year, I'm going to have a budget deficit at the end of the year. Because remember, we only have 2 sources of revenue. The budget's made up of tuition and fees, both non-resident and resident, as well as the general fund appropriation. In the current year, we're only going to be at about 60% of what our estimate was. Anticipating that, we kind of reserved relative to that. But for next year, our budget for non-residents is going to be predicated on what we actually made in the current year. If we enroll more, that's good, for example, because that then becomes revenue that would enable me to have somebody once asked, hey, so where do you get funds to contribute to meeting our budget deficit on a one-time basis? Well, it's through some of those kinds of things that we're able to do that. We have the lowest ratio of administrators to employees of any of the CSUs. I dare you to go and find a president's office in the CSU where the president has 1.5 staff people supporting him and an executive assistant. I dare you to find sister CSUs, even the small ones, where a college only has a dean and 1 associate or assistant dean. All of our colleges only have 1 associate dean. And the reason for that, and part of the reason why we're able to try to keep what the net price is to you low, is that we've tried to reduce the number of people who work in management positions at this university and to try to devote those resources otherwise. It may sound somewhat serendipitous, but when I go down to the trustees meetings, I don't stay in Long Beach. I drive home. It's about a 40-mile drive. But I don't stay down there because there's a cost associated with staying down there. I don't go to a lot of the professional and national meetings anymore because to go to the American Council on Ed meeting in Washington is $5,000. For $4,400, I can add another section of remedial English. That's how we, whether you believe it or not, that's how we think. And that's what we've tried to do over the time that I have been here. You know, somebody said the other day, why do you always say that this is a student-centered campus? Why couldn't it be faculty-centered? Well, at the end of the day, this university doesn't exist to provide jobs for people, okay? It exists to try to educate students. And so if a decision we make can't be tracked back to what it does for students, then we shouldn't be making that decision. So we're trying to become more evidence responsible as it relates to this, and we're trying to become more transparent. The budget for the student success fees is going to be on the website. You'll see what we are going to be spending money on, and you'll see how much we spend at the end of the year. There'll be a report that will go to the Student Fee Advisory Committee, and there'll be a report that will go to RAC. If they're leftover resources, they'll get rolled into the next year to try to provide support and services for students. So that was our commitment. These are dollars that will be spent for nothing other than what we've defined that they will be spent for. And we want to be held accountable with regard to that. And we also are going to be building into the budget process. If we provide money for additional advisors to the business college, we're going to want to know from the business college whether students and faculty felt that that additional level of support reduced time to degree, enhanced student satisfaction relative to their courses, it enabled students to get their courses on a more timely basis, et cetera. So they're going to be benchmarks for allocations as relates to these fees. And that's gonna, I sort of said to the vice presidents yesterday, that ought to be built into their requests. So if you're requesting X, then tell me how you're gonna assess whether it was effective or not. And all of that information is gonna be available for you to see.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to apologize to the public. We need to move on to certain items on the agenda, unless the board would like to extend more time and see if we want to have one more question from the public. Okay. All right. Does anybody in the public would like to ask a question? Go ahead and present yourself.
Felix Rosenbaum, political science major. And basically, I hear what you say about the student success fee, and I understand it's now, of course, with your explanation of it, that it was more of a recommendation. But don't you feel, in some manner, it's more of a correlation, believing that advisement is lacking in some area? I mean, do we have definitive evidence stating that this is the problem?
Yes.
We do?
Yes. Historical data.
Historical data?
Every time, the CSU every 3 to 4 years does a survey of students called a SNAPS survey,
Okay.
for example. And every year we also participate in a survey that's done by the UCLA Graduate School of Education that measures student satisfaction. In my 33 years in the CSU, the single most important, if you will, criticism that students CSU-wide have always had about the CSU is a lack of adequate advisement. And that has been the case here on a historic basis. The other is that there is a task force report that was done by the Dean of Undergraduate Studies, for example, that is included in our WASC reaccreditation visit, where we were more or less chastised by WASC to move on an expeditious basis to implement the task force's recommendations with regard to advisement. And we agreed to do that.
And if I may, to continue on with that question, was it, did they show which ratio of the population, of the student population was suffering more from that? Was this the upper grads, or was this mostly, the upper division undergrads, or was this mostly the incoming freshmen, those who are doing remedial, those who are?
No, it was undergraduates generally. What's really intriguing about your question, entering students who enter the EOP program or who enter through Summer Bridge, they do better relative to, if you will, retention and whatever, because they have those support services in a more definitive way than otherwise is the case. What's really intriguing about Early Start early on got confused with Summer Bridge, for example, because what Early Start is purporting to do, Summer Bridge does in a much more comprehensive manner. Summer Bridge isn't just devoted to remediation in math and English. Summer Bridge is about collegiate success, for example, and all of those factors that come into play as relates to that, which is probably why a lot of CSUs no longer offer Summer Bridge or reduce the level to which they support Summer Bridge. But all of this comes as a result of evidence. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but 20% of what faculty members get paid as a basic aspect of what their duties are involves advisement. Faculty are expected to teach 12 weighted teaching units a quarter, and they have 3 weighted teaching units for advisement, for committee work, and for curriculum development. So at a minimum, a third of that should go to support that. What we've said, and was part of the task force report, is that we would like to get to this ratio of headcount students to advisors in our respective colleges and majors, and we want to have this ratio of permanent faculty to students in the major. So we're saying 38 to 1. So we have some programs right now where we don't have enough faculty for the number of students who are in the major. For example, child development. seriously lacking in permanent faculty. And so these are some of the issues that we're also beginning to have to address, because part-time and temporary faculty don't have any responsibility for advisement. They only teach, generally speaking, at the university.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we need to move forward. We get the funding request form coming in right now.
I may need to come back and visit with you all at a later date, because after the May revise, that's a critical date. That's when the controller and the treasurer will essentially tell us how much money they've collected. And that's probably going to precipitate some additional trustee meetings with regard to that. And there may be a need to make some additional adjustments, because the governor probably may end up having to readjust his budget. And again, I would advise you, there may be some revised budget guidelines coming down. I really would like for you all to seriously consider those budget guidelines in terms of what your disposition happens to be with respect to them, you know, for example. But I may have to come back, and it may be at a time that may be difficult for you, you know, for example, but I may have to come back and share additional information with you with regard to this. Usually after the May revise, I do make a presentation at the Academic Senate about what the forecast is for the upcoming year, and I will try to give you some further information relative to that. And as far as early start is concerned, it's not coming out of campus-based resources. What the CSU did is it took money off the top, out of the lottery fund that the system gets, to provide support for students who couldn't afford going to early start this coming summer. For example. But I'd be more than happy to come back and visit you further. And Johan, if you would like some further discourse about the question you raised, I'd be more than happy, you know, essentially to do that. And I can tell you that it's San Bernardino has one of these fees.
None.
Long Beach has one, and I'm sure you know this, because believe it or not, Cal Poly at SLO, its students voted to increase their fees by almost $1,000 a year.
That's true.
And this is part of the issue with regard to equity in the CSU. Okay? Every CSU gets funded for enrollment, not at the same level. You know, we get about $1,300 more per FTE than Long Beach State. So the more enrollments Long Beach State gets or takes in, the fewer dollars it has to support quality education.
And I can guarantee you that when I speak to the president of the ASIs of those campuses that have had student success fees, every month at CSSA, it's a scramble to strategize to how to make sure that we get our voices heard in the regards that we don't support it. No campuses, not one of those presidents has come up to me and said, we have a fee in our campus and we really like it. We all say we have a fee in our campus and we're trying to figure out how to get rid of it.
Well, one of the ways maybe to get rid of it might possibly be if the Assembly Speaker is successful. But given the latest budget projections, I really wonder whether he might be. But if his proposal and the chancellors come out in support of it, along with the University of California, if the Speaker is successful relative to his middle class sort of income level of financial aid support, it could potentially reduce tuition and fees in the CSU down to $2,000 a year, for example. Now, what's really intriguing about that is that I don't know what that would do to what we get in terms of Pell Grant dollars, because California is the largest Pell Grant state in the country as relates to this. And in spite of the significant increase in, if you will, tuition and fees over the last actually it's been longer than that. It's been 22 years, folks, because it really got bad in 1990-91. This university's budget was reduced by 1/3 in 1 year in 1990-91. And that's when the compact occurred. You know, this governor, and I go back a long way, he was the governor when I got appointed here. I wasn't a fan of his then, and I'm still not that much of a fan of his now, because he's not been a fan of the CSU. And anytime someone says that a reporter can do my job as well as I do my job, I'm insulted. So if he doesn't respect me, I don't have any respect for him either. And you can quote me.
Sorry about that. It's hard to do.
Okay, so